My name is Jean Adams. I work at the Centre for Diet and Activity Research in the MRC Epidemiology Unit, which is in the University of Cambridge. So actually I'm a researcher historically. My original training was in medicine, which I very rarely mention, but came up earlier today. And lots of people here seem to be practitioners in one way or another. And I had a conversation earlier today which reminded me of just how frustrating working in primary care can be, and that seems to be reflected in working in dietetic practice maybe. So I really wanted to start by saying that most of my research is looking at food environments and structural interventions that we can deploy to try and make it easier for people to eat well. So mostly not at all things like teaching people stuff, like teaching people to cook, mostly things like we're doing some work on soda taxes, so changing the price structure of different foods. We're doing some work on labeling and as a mechanism to try and prompt reformulation in restaurants and things like that. But very often when I tell normal people what I do, they say, oh yes, isn't the problem with diet that young men don't know how to cook? Which is how I got interested in cooking. I started off by wondering, well, is the problem that young men don't know how to cook? Maybe that is a problem, or maybe it's not, and that's where I started. But it, I think quite quickly led me into really thinking about the potential relationship between cooking and health and diet, and what, if anything, we might be able to do about that. And maybe you can tell from my title that I quickly got a little bit frustrated by it, which is what led me to the concept of food literacy, of maybe that can help me out with this. There's many people that I've worked on this area with, but I wanted to kind of pay particular tribute to these three people who have been PhD students with me over the years and have really helped me to think much harder and more broadly about what cooking is and what role it might play in our lives. Okay, so I think we start from this idea that the problem is that young men don't know how to cook. That is the whole problem with diets. Comes from, I think, an intuitive belief that cooking is just a good thing. And I think that there might be three premises underlying that. Firstly, that eating home prepared foods improves your diet quality, or cooking improves diet quality and health. Importantly, that our ability to cook has changed over time, and that might explain why dietary quality has declined over time. And there's also something going on about poorer people might not know how to cook as well as more affluent people. And so cooking might explain inequalities in diet. And then the kind of third part of the story is that then we assume that teaching people to cook will solve all of these problems. So I'd like to interrogate each of these a little bit and perhaps come to some conclusions about what we know about these things. I'd probably not the answers, but what we know about them so far. So firstly, this idea that cooking improves diet quality and health has become so ingrained that it is now in at least 2 national dietary recommendations in Brazil and in Canada. It's not in the UK's national dietary recommendations, but I wouldn't be surprised if this becomes more common. So there is quite a lot of evidence that something about being exposed to cooking improves diet quality. This is an example from our own work, which I see is already mangled. Mangled in all sorts of ways. So your red line should be at the bottom. Your red line is your line of equivalency, should be at the bottom. So this is work from a large cohort in Cambridgeshire, 11,000 adults who are between 30 and 50, I think, so middle-aged adults. I am now one of them. Looking at the relationship between how frequently people report that their main meal at home, the main meal that they ate every day of the week was cooked at home, and the quantity of fruit and veg that they report eating. So if you can't make it out, which I wouldn't blame you for. The conclusion here is that people who report that their main meal was cooked at home more than 5 days a week in the last week eat 60 grams more fruit and 100 grams more veg per day. So that's, in UK parlance, that's 2 portions of fruit and veg, and we have a 5 a day target. So that is quite a lot of fruit and veg. So eating home prepared food seems to be associated in this study with one marker of dietary quality. And this is not an unusual finding. Much work reports similar findings. Much of it like this is cross-sectional, and we can't be sure what the direction of causation is. And much of it relies on some of the problems here, that whether fruit and veg is the best marker of dietary quality, whether this question of how often was your main meal cooked at home measures anything in particular. It was a question that, as far as I know, was made up by some colleagues, has no potential validity. So then there's a whole bunch of other work that kind of looks at it from the other side. Wow, my slides are really messed up. There's some text missing from here. But so there's a whole bunch of work that looks at this idea from the other side of maybe we can look at the relationship between not cooking and dietary quality. So this is results from a large systematic review and meta-analysis that we've just completed that looks at the relationship between consumption of ultra-processed food and cardiovascular disease in green, and it's diabetes there in orange at the bottom. So you can see that the more ultra-processed food people eat, the higher their risk of cardiovascular disease, a much stronger relationship with diabetes. So it's only when you get above about 50% of your energy is from ultra-processed food that increased risk of cardiovascular disease becomes significant. But almost any consumption of ultra-processed food increases your risk of diabetes at the bottom there. So perhaps we can conclude from this is longitudinal work, so improves on the cross-sectional work I showed in the previous slide. We can perhaps conclude from this that not cooking is associated with poorer health. So I know that, so I'm a public health scientist, and our work is based on epidemiology, which is about averages and looking at general relationships across the population. But it is interesting to me that there are many examples of where we can point out that perhaps cooking is not as good for you as the kind of general statistics suggest. So this is a quote from one of Susanna Mill's interviews with people who were living in the northeast of England. And it illustrates for me something that's kind of obvious, that you can home cook stuff that's not very good for you, right? So this is, someone was asked, what does home cooking mean to you? And they described mince and dumplings. Dumplings are suet puddings that you boil and stew. And then they went on to talk about sweet rice pudding. So this was a whole meal that was essentially carbs and no fruit and veg. And that was not an uncommon finding, that home cooking meant to people a particular sort of cooking that we wouldn't necessarily associate with a healthier diet. And to me, the bake sale is the kind of exemplar of that, right? We've all got experience of people can do a lot of work in their kitchen and come out with something that's not necessarily supportive of a healthy diet. And this table at the bottom was some work done by Chloe Clifford-Asbury, asking the question of, so sure, in general, cooking seems to be associated with better dietary quality, but is it possible to eat well and not rely on home prepared food? So this is a simple cross tabulation of tertiles of the percentage of energy that people in the UK National Diet and Nutrition Survey were obtaining from home prepared food, against tertiles of DASH score, which is one measure of dietary quality. And you can see that there's a small number of people, a small number of people here in the low proportion of energy from home prepared food, but high DASH score who are making it. These people are not consuming, doing much cooking, but they are managing to have high dietary quality. And that, I mean, there's lots of questions about what they're eating and who are these people. They, interestingly, stand out as very affluent. Not quite sure what it is that they're eating, and that's something that we have to explore further, but indicates to me that it is possible to do the reverse, to eat well without cooking. So it's somewhere around this point that I start to wonder, kind of start to unpick what's the conceptual model here, like what is it that we're talking about? And I think that it's something like this, that I've shown you various different measures of cooking. So that was what's your main meal at home, what percentage of energy was home prepared, oh yeah, ultra processed food consumption. These are all really different things, and it makes me wonder conceptually what's going on. So I think it's something like, we think that if you have better cooking skills, you will more frequently prepare food at home. Therefore, you'll more frequently consume food prepared at home, and that will lead to better dietary quality and eventually better health. So then when we overlay the way that we measure all of these things onto this kind of conceptual diagram, I think you can start to see why the literature is really complicated here. We have many different measures of all of these different concepts. And we even get to a point where we've got the same measure here, which is ultra processed food might be a measure of exposure to lower consumption of home prepared food, but also might be a measure of our outcome of dietary quality, right? So we're kind of really messed up here in what it is we're measuring, what it is we mean, and whether we're even talking ourselves around in circles, I think. And I think the other thing that thinking about this conceptually helps me to do is working out some really obvious places where the whole thing falls down. So you can think of all sorts of things, I'm sure, that you're well able to do, but that you don't do every day, you know, from perhaps knitting to skiing, right? That you might have the skills to do something, but there's all sorts of things that mediate whether that is something that gets done every day. But also it's entirely possible to eat a lot of home prepared food without doing it yourself, right? Someone else can do it for you, whether that's your partner or a housemate or something else. And as Chloe's work illustrates, it's entirely possible to eat a good quality diet, sourcing your foods from elsewhere, sourcing your food from not from home prepared sources. So all of this starts to make me wonder whether this is as simple as people tell me that the problem is that young men don't know how to cook. But it also makes me think that we don't really know what we're talking about when we start to think about cooking and whether cooking is a thing that we need to intervene on. Or, I mean, that's pretty harsh. We don't know what we're talking about. We haven't carefully thought through what we think might be going on, maybe. So does cooking improve diet and health? My very brief summary is lots of cross-sectional evidence says yes. There is a small number of longitudinal studies that are supportive. But I think in general, longitudinal evidence is lacking. But I think, as I think I've demonstrated, that I think we have poor conceptual clarity of what's going on. And that leads to poor operational clarity, which is we don't have a clear understanding of how to measure the things that might be going on in this pathway. I think because we perhaps are not thinking clearly about what the pathway is. This substantial element of moralizing is demonstrated a little bit on the next slide, but I think that it is important to think about that. And I haven't shown you quotes, but certainly some of the quotes from Susanna's work pick up on the idea that there's just something about being a good person, a good parent, particularly a good mother, a good woman, that's related to cooking. And I think that there is a risk here that we start telling people what's the best way to live one's life, and that there is some sort of moralizing going on, although I haven't explored it very, very much, but I worry about that as well. This is a woman called Baroness Jenkin, who is a UK parliamentarian of long standing, who has somehow got interested in the problem of obesity and diet, and occasionally comes out with fairly crass comments like this, which make good slides, but I think also illustrate issues, right? This illustrates, I think, my issue of moralizing, but also this issue that this problem of my second premise, which is that there's been a recent decline in cooking, and particularly that's been amongst less affluent groups. And I presume that what the next thought in her head is that explains inequalities in diet. I should give her her due. She did actually, this led to a lot of fuss in the press in the UK, and she quite quickly said sorry. So makes a good slide, but probably not all it looks like it is. So has there been a recent decline in cooking? This is data from, in blue, again, our National Diet and Nutrition Survey, which is in the UK an annual national surveillance survey that's been going on since 2008. In 2008, but never again, there was a number of questions about cooking skills in NDNS, which allowed us to look at the proportion of people who said they could cook all of these things without any help, which again raises a question of, is that cooking for me? But that's the sort of data that we have. The data, the bars in brown, is from something called the International Food Policy Study, which is an online survey of a number of countries, including the UK and Australia. And we were able to ask them to include exactly the same questions in that in 2018 to be able to draw some comparisons. These are very simple descriptive comparisons that are not adjusted for the difference in the makeup of the two different surveys, but were somewhat striking for me, because I've been going around for the last 10 years going, we don't have a problem with cooking in this country, or in the UK. And then suddenly saw this, and that this was not expected for me, that over the last 10 years, perhaps there has been a marked decrease in the proportion who are able to do these things. Although, again, with the caveat that I'm not sure that this is cooking, but anyhow. This is exactly the same two surveys broken down by high and low socioeconomic position to try and get at this issue of whether less affluent people in particular have poor cooking skills. So in 2008, if anything, it was the case that people of low socioeconomic position, this was occupational social class in 2008, reported slightly poorer cooking skills. But you know, it was not clear cut, but the story we told was that perhaps there are inequalities disadvantaging less affluent people. In 2018, you can see the trend has reversed, and less affluent people are reporting better skills in these things and higher frequency of preparing meals at home. So that's interesting for me, and this is very preliminary analysis of this data. I don't know what the explanation for this is, but I might pull at something like, if you have fewer resources, you're forced to rely on your own resources at home. I don't know why that might have changed over time. This is similar data from well, similar, not really, data looking at inequalities in time spent cooking from the US. So Lindsay Smith-Talley has looked at a number of time use surveys since the 1960s in the US and plotted the amount of time that people reported cooking over 24 hours over the last 50 years, I guess it is. And so this is just the proportion of people reporting any cooking at all, not how much of it, how much time they spent on cooking. And as you'd expect, women spend more time cooking than men, although that difference has really narrowed over time. The increase in men reporting cooking doesn't outweigh or doesn't equal the decrease in women. So that indicates that there has been a decrease overall in the proportion of people cooking. But the inequality for me, again, is interesting that if anything, it looks like lower income people are more likely to be cooking, although that is again narrowing over time. Okay, so has there been a recent decline in cooking? I think that probably we have growing evidence that maybe yes, there has been. Although I wanted to put that into some sort of historical context, and in the UK we often come back to the Boer War. I don't know why, but there was a lot of social angst around the Boer War and the poor physical quality of recruits, so recruits to the army. So apparently, even 100 years ago in the UK, we were angsting about the fact that the reason that people were coming forward for conscription into the army, being malnourished, was that their mothers didn't know how to cook. So apparently that was the source of the first requirement for cooking education in the UK school curriculum. So the perspective is that we have been worrying about this for a long time, but it does seem to me that there may have been a recent decline in cooking. But those differences don't necessarily reflect the differences in diet and diet-related ill health that we see, particularly by socioeconomic position. But again, I would indicate that, well, I don't know if it's pure conceptual clarity, but we have many different measures that we're looking at this by. So it's clearly, whether this just reflects the data that we have access to, we're not pushing for good quality data, I think, on something in particular that would measure cooking well. Okay, so my third premise was that teaching people to cook will solve these problems. I'm glad that you know who Jamie is, but that he also often says silly things that get him in trouble in the press. This was a while ago when the rest of this quote was something to do with people would rather spend their money on massive flat screen TVs than teaching their kids to cook or something like that. But again, I think illustrating the moralizing around cooking. And you all know that part of Jamie's mission is to teach people to cook, or was maybe 10 years ago, yeah. So there's been a number of systematic reviews that have tried to bring together, synthesize the evidence on cooking related interventions. So in the UK, maybe about 10 or 15 years ago, we also had a politician who didn't know how to cook that triggered a whole bunch of cooking skills interventions. That triggered a bunch of evaluations, and that allows us to do synthesis and systematic reviews. So the top one is from the UK, but the findings of these are relatively consistent, that we do this a lot, we evaluate it a bit, but we don't tend to do particularly strong evaluations from a scientific point of view. That many evaluations might not have a control group, so they might just be a before or after study, or if they do have a control group, they might not be randomized. And then we really have this problem of we don't know what it is we're supposed to be measuring, which I've mentioned many times, that we have so many different ways that we can conceptualize cooking that it's never clear what it is that the intervention is perhaps trying to change. I think that there's a number of other reasons why we might be skeptical about whether cooking could be a widespread way to change diet. Cooking interventions could be a widespread way to change diet. And I have a couple of examples to illustrate, but I think that there's a wider problem that I'll also come to. So again, the top thing here is a quote from one of Susanna Mills's interviews with adults in the northeast of England, where she was trying to understand whether people wanted to learn to cook better. And to me, this captures the issue of that, you know, cooking skills, that's only in food skills, are only one part of many competing priorities in everybody's daily lives. And that people learn to kind of balance those and come to some sort of equilibrium that they're comfortable with, right? That they maybe have some vague aspiration to do better in some parts of their life, but that the other demands in their life stop them from realizing that aspiration. But that if it was something that they were so unhappy with, that it made them uncomfortable, they would try and do something about that themselves, right? So people kind of saying, well, you know, it's good enough for me. And this was, I guess, this idea that people are kind of happy with their place was illustrated in a pilot RCT we tried to do of Jamie Oliver's Ministry of Food, which I think also has run in Australia. So these are community-based 8-week-long basic cooking skills programs. So we were trying to offer people that free program branded with Jamie. You got to come to 8 free 2 or 3 hour lessons. We tried to focus our recruitment particularly on people that the descriptive data told us had the poorest cooking skills. So those were middle-aged men who were single. And we found it really hard to recruit these people. We went to where we thought those people might hang out, which was transport depots, so bus depots and underground train depots. And we really struggled. So people were not into taking part in this intervention. So we got of 403 people that we spoke to 403 people that we spoke to face to face. We recruited about less than 20% of those, but that underestimates, I think, because we did a lot of social media attempts at recruitment. And then maybe only about 15% stayed their course through the program. So there's something here, I think, not just about this idea that people are maybe happy with where they are, but that perhaps if they're not, it's embarrassing to admit it to, well, the recruiter was a young man, but it's embarrassing to admit it to someone that you don't know. Okay, so this is a kind of wider, so this is, I think, the wider problem with cooking interventions. So Susanna's interviews illustrated that there were certainly some people who at moments in their life might want to learn to cook and would make that effort. And so that was people at kind of life transitions, had a baby, lost a partner, retired. But as oops, I didn't do anything there. Cool. Oh, we got bored. Fine. Okay, I'm just about to finish. So there may be a place, I think, for very targeted cooking interventions, but as a widespread intervention, I think, to me, there's this wider problem that these interventions are highly agentic, by which I mean people have to put a lot of effort in to benefit from them. So you have to identify that they want to learn, they have to find a class, go to the class, remember what they've been taught, apply that learning not just in the supermarket, but at home when there might not be a class facilitator to help them out when things go wrong. And so that requires them to have access to a whole bunch of other stuff on the side to make this sort of intervention work. And I suspect that a lot of this is also socioeconomically patterned. So we have an intervention that I think probably is not able to attract a lot of people or be delivered to a lot of people. It's difficult to roll that sort of thing out wide scale, but so might not be wildly effective in terms of changing the dietary landscape, but may also lead to inequalities in who can benefit. Okay, so in conclusion, I think from all of this that we have a poor conceptualization of cooking and its role in diet and health, and that leads to us measuring a lot of different things and not quite knowing what it is we're trying to measure, what questions we're really asking, and that limits our ability to synthesize evidence. I think when we start to interrogate some of the implicit conceptualizations that are going on, we realize that part of the pathway might start to break down, and that there may be many other things going on linking social practice to food practice. And that there is a problem that when we try and think of cooking skills interventions, that they are highly agentic, may be really useful if targeted at exactly the right people, but probably difficult to roll out and may lead to inequitable effects. Which makes me think that there may be more value in changing the circumstances in which food practices take place rather than changing the people who are doing the food practices. I'm going to end there. Thank you.